Ladies and gentlemen, meet David Sedaris.
I'm so grateful that you came. You have your own people to listen to, so to show up for me here, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I was going to begin by reading this essay, and it's called Father Time. The night before his 95th birthday party, my father fell while turning around in his kitchen. My sister Lisa and her husband Bob dropped by hours later to hook up his new TV and discovered him on the floor, disoriented and in pain. He fell again after they righted him, so an ambulance was called. At the hospital, they met up with our sister Gretchen and with Amy, who'd just flown in from New York to attend the party, which was now canceled. It was really weird, she said, when we spoke on the phone the following morning. Dad thought Lisa was Mom. And when the doctor asked him where he was, he answered Syracuse, where he went to college. Then he got mad and said, "You're sure asking a lot of questions," as if that's not normal for a doctor. I think he thought this was just some guy he was talking to. Fortunately, he was lucid again by the following afternoon. That was the hard part for everyone, seeing him so confused. On the night that my father fell, I was in Princeton, the fourth of 80 cities I would be traveling to for work. On the morning he was moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation center, I was on my way to Ann Arbor. Over the next week, he had a few little strokes, the sort people don't notice right away. One affected his peripheral vision, and another his short-term memory. He'd wanted to return home after leaving rehab, but by this point there was no way he could continue to live alone. I wrote him a letter saying, in part, "It isn't safe for you at the house anymore, at least not on your own, and this concerns me. I need you to live long enough to see Donald Trump impeached." We'd fought bitterly after the election, and I knew it would be just my luck. My father would die, and the very next day the president would go down, denying me a well-deserved opportunity to gloat. I'm not sure where I was when my father moved into his assisted living facility, Springmore, it's called. I saw it finally 4 months after his fall when Hugh and I flew to North Carolina. It was early August, and we arrived to find him in an easy chair, blood flowing from his ear at what seemed to me like a pretty alarming rate. It looked fake, like beet juice, and was being dabbed at by a nurse's assistant. "Oh, hello," my father said, his voice soft and weary-sounding. I thought he didn't know who I was, but then he added my name and held out his hand. "David?" He looked behind me. "Hugh?" Someone had wrapped his head with gauze, and when he leaned back, he resembled the late English poet, Edith Sitwell. Very distinguished looking, almost imperious. His eyebrows were thin and barely perceptible. It was the same with his lashes. I guessed that, like the hair on his arms and legs, they just got tired of holding on. "So what happened?" I asked, though I already knew. Lisa had told me that morning on the phone that his grandfather clock had fallen on him. It was made of walnut and bronze and had an abstract human face on it, surrounded by numbers that were tilted at odd angles. My mother always referred to it as Mr. Creech, after the artist who made it, but my dad calls it Father Time. I'd said to Hugh after hanging up with Lisa, "When you're 95 and Father Time literally knocks you to the ground, don't you think he's maybe trying to tell you something?" "He insisted on moving it himself," the woman attempting to staunch the bleeding said, "and it cut his ear. We sent him to the hospital for stitches, but now it's started up again, maybe because he's on blood thinners, so we've called an ambulance." She raised her voice, even though my father is not hard of hearing. "Haven't we, Lou? Haven't we called an ambulance?" At that moment, 2 ambulance men came in, both young and bearded, like lumberjacks. Each took an elbow and helped my father to stand. "Are we going somewhere?" he asked. "Back to the hospital," the woman shouted. "All right," my father said. "Okay." They wheeled him out, and the woman explained that while the staff would remove bloodstains from the carpet, it was the family's job to get them off any privately owned furniture. "I can bring you some towels," she suggested. A few moments later, another aide walked into the room. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you the famous son?" "I'm a pretty sorry excuse for famous," I told her, "but yes, I'm his son." "So you're Dave. Dave Chappelle." "Can I have your autograph? Actually, can I have two?" Sure," I said. I just joined Hugh in cleaning the easy chair when the woman, who seemed slightly nervous, the way you might be around a world-famous comedian who is young and black and has his whole life ahead of him, returned for two more autographs. "I'm the worst son in the world," I told her, reaching for the scraps of paper she was holding out. "My father fell on April 7th, and this is the first time I visited, the first time I've talked to him even." "You put yourself down too much," the woman said. "Just pick up the phone every so often. That's what I do with my mother." She offered a forgiving smile. "You can make that second autograph to my supervisor." And she gave me a name. The blood on our wet rags looked even faker than the blood I'd watched falling from my father's ear. I took a few half-hearted swipes at the easy chair, but it was Hugh who did most of the work. Mainly I looked at the things my dad had decorated his room with. Father Time, a number of the streetscapes he and my mother bought in the 70s, rocks he'd carried back from fishing trips, each with a date and the name of the river it had come from written on it. All of it so depressing to me. Then again, even a unicorn would have looked dingy in this place. I don't know if it was the lighting or the height of the ceilings. Perhaps it was a hospital bed against the wall or the floor-length curtains that looked as if they came from a funeral parlor. Down the hall, a dozen or so residents, most in wheelchairs and some drooling onto bibs, were watching MASH on television. I couldn't help but think of Mayview, the nursing home my father put his mother in back in the mid-'70s. It seemed like only yesterday that I'd gone with him to see her. If now here I was, visiting him in a similar place, wouldn't it be me in the blink of an eye in my own assisted living facility? Me, the frail widower, reduced to a single room? Only I won't have children to look after me the way my father has Lisa, who had been extraordinary, and my brother Paul and Amy and Gretchen. My sister-in-law Kathy had outdone everyone, stopping by sometimes twice a day, taking Dad to lunch, rubbing lotion into his feet. I was the only exception. Me, Dave Chappelle. "Do you think we can get a few pictures together?" one of the nurses asked me on my way out. "Oh, wait, I want one too," another woman said, and another after her. "Look," I imagined them telling people afterward, "I got a photo of me with Dave Chappelle." "No, you didn't," they'd be told. Of course, I'd be long gone by then. Like always. Hugh and I drove to our house on Emerald Isle, the C-section, after leaving Springmore, and were joined a few days later by his older brother John, who brought two boys, his 7-year-old grandson Harrison, and Harrison's half-brother Austin, who was 11. All three live in a small town on a strait several hours west of Seattle. The kids had never encountered water they could walk into without shrieking from the cold. They'd never seen fine sand or pelicans. I thought they'd be thrilled, but it was hard luring them away from the portable gaming console they'd brought from Washington, a Nintendo Switch. "What?" Harrison cried, exasperated after touring the house. "You don't have a TV we can hook this up to?" He was one of those children who'd skipped cute and gone straight to handsome. I suppose this could change over the next few decades. His nose might grow out of proportion to the rest of his face. He could lose his chin or a cheek in some sort of accident. But even then, he'd have his eyes, which were cornflower blue, and a pouty, almost feminine mouth, the lower lip slightly larger than the top one. Everywhere he went, he was the best-looking person in the room. Does he realize it, I wondered? Kids his age are usually oblivious. Looks aside, Harrison and his half-brother, both of whom live with their mother, were far from spoiled. The Nintendo was something John had given them earlier that year. They weren't allowed one at home, and after a few minutes, I could understand why. The console was the first thing they'd reach for in the morning and the last thing they'd look at before going to bed, which most nights was well after 1 a.m. The boys didn't seem to have any rules the way I did when I was their age. "You can't just leave the table," I said to Harrison on the first night of his visit, when he finished his dinner and ran off to play Minecraft. "You have to ask to be excused." "No, I don't." "No, I don't, Mr. Sedaris." I made the boys call me that and would correct them whenever they slipped up. "I'm an adult and you're guests in my house." "It's not your house, it's Hugh's," Harrison said. Hugh looked up from his plate. "He's right. Look at the deed. The place is in my name." "Yes, well, I bought it," I said. Harrison rolled his eyes. "Yeah, right." The following afternoon, I came down from my desk and found him and his brother on the sofa, gaming again. "Why don't you put the Nintendo away and write a letter to your mother?" I said. Harrison nudged Austin in the ribs. "Stranger danger." This apparently was something they'd learned in school. "Don't talk to him." "I'm not a stranger. I'm your host, and it wouldn't hurt you to be a little more like me for a change." "What's so good about you?" Harrison asked. "Two things," I said, my mind racing as I tried to think of something. "I'm rich, and I'm famous." He shook his head, eyes locked on his game. "I don't believe a word you say." "Hugh," I called, "will you tell Harrison I'm rich and famous?" "I think he's on the beach," Austin said, his eyes glued, like his half-brother's, to the paperback-sized console they were sharing. "What'd you do to get famous?" "Wrote books," I said. "Well, I never heard of any of them," Harrison told me. "That's because you're 7, I said, more hurt than I cared to admit. "Grown-ups know who I am, especially nurses." Later that afternoon, for the 4th time that week, Hugh saw someone taking pictures of our house. "I think they read your last book," he said. "See?" I shouted to Harrison in the next room. He was into his game and didn't answer. "They're most likely just taking pictures of the C-section sign," I said to Hugh. "It is a pretty good name for a beach house." I then told him about a place our neighbor Burmy had mentioned that was further up the coast and was called "You Didn't Get This, Bitch." "That probably gets photographed as well," I said, "especially by divorced men." The picture taking on the street side of our house was nothing compared to what was going on out back. When I was young, sea turtles would lay their eggs on the beach and no one thought much about it. Now, though, it's a huge deal. Loggerheads are on bumper stickers and signs. They're an attraction, like the wild horses near Ocracoke. The spot where the eggs are laid is marked, and when the time arrives for them to hatch, a team of volunteers from the Turtle Patrol is dispatched. A bright yellow stake had been driven into the sand near the foot of the wooden staircase that led from our house to the beach. And the morning after the boys arrived, volunteers dug a trench that would make it easier for the hatchlings to find the ocean. Now it was lined on either side with folding chairs and the Turtle Patrol, nest-sitting. I said to Hugh, "It's like the red carpet at the Academy Awards." People walking down the beach, seeing the yellow caution tape and the trench watched over by do-gooders in bright Turtle Patrol T-shirts, wandered over to ask questions, and the crowd grew. At night, they'd sit with infrared flashlights, intently staring down, watching for the slightest movement with their cameras at the ready. "It's actually called a boil," Kathy told me. "That's because when the eggs hatch and the babies claw their way to the surface, the sand churns." "Isn't that exciting?" I said to the boys. "Uh-huh," they answered. "Sure." "Really?" I said. "You're not interested in nature?" When I was their age, it was pretty much all I cared about. That and stealing and spying on people. I told them about the hideous-looking silver possum who'd climbed up the front stairs of the house last Thanksgiving. We fed her fruit and leftovers, and you should have seen the way her hands grabbed the food, almost like a human. Every night she came. Austin politely but vacantly said, "Wow." The only way to get the boys' attention was by throwing one of the stink bombs I'd bought earlier that week on Cape Cod. I thought the smell would be negligible, maybe like an old sock, but instead it cleared not just the room where the boys were playing Mario Kart, but an entire side of the house. It was sulfur for the most part, what I imagined Satan's bathroom would smell like after he'd been on the toilet with the National Review for a while. "God damn it," Hugh said, holding his nose and opening the front and back doors, letting the hot, humid air in. "And we have company coming." "Why, you book writer," Harrison scolded. He was wearing Minecraft pajamas and looked like a male model who'd been put into a machine and made small. Of the two brothers, Austin had the sweeter temperament. He'd ask questions and offer to help out. His voice had an old-fashioned quality to it, like a boy's in a radio serial. "Gee Willikers," you could imagine him saying, if that were the name of a video game in which things blew up and women got shot in the back of the head. Compared to other kids I've known, the two were actually pretty good. Both liked fish, and they always ate everything on their plates. Rarely did they bicker, and when they did, it was over within a minute or two. There was no crying, and better still, no sulking. That, to me, is unbearable. "Oh, move on, for God's sake," my mother used to say when we glared and stewed, vowing to never forget the injustice of egg salad or potato chips that were from the bottom of the bag and broken. The boys weren't terribly interested in the boil taking place in the back of the house, but I thought they might change their minds if they saw the baby loggerheads. The eggs were the size of ping-pong balls and were supposed to hatch on Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. At night, we'd walk to the top of our stairway and see if there was any action. "Aren't we lucky to have a front row seat?" I'd say. "If you say so," Harrison would answer. My 15-year-old niece, Maddie, had the same attitude. She was at the beach as well, though you'd hardly know it. We'd see her briefly at lunch and dinner, but the rest of her time was spent in seclusion, her face 6 inches from her phone. Was there an equivalent when I was young, I wondered? I don't recall my parents crying, "You and that goddamn transistor radio." The boys slept in what we'd come to think of as my father's room. It was strange being at the beach without him, but we didn't yet have the proper equipment, a walk-in shower, bars beside the toilet, and so on. A year earlier, he hadn't needed those things, but that's the difference between 94 and 95. The day before his fall, he'd driven to the gym, not knowing that it was his last time behind the wheel of a car, his last night in his own bed. There would be a lot of that in his immediate future. The last time he could dress himself, the last time he could walk. I worried that he had entered a period when it would be one thing after another, death by 1,000 cuts, a fall, a stroke, an accident with a grandfather clock. That's how it was with the other extremely old people I've known in my life. The woman across the road from us in Normandy, our next-door neighbor in London, the comedian Phyllis Diller. Late in her life, the two of us became friends. She lived in a mansion in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, and each time I'd visit her there, she'd be a little less able. Her eyes wouldn't stop watering, or she couldn't get up from a chair. Phyllis was lucky in that she could remain at home and hire round-the-clock help. Lucky, too, that she was famous, a legend by any definition. All day, disciples came to pay homage to her, and every night she went out. Thus, she was spared the loneliness so many old people have to suffer. The last time I went to her house, I found her on the back patio. It was 1 p.m, and she was having a martini. "Carla," she called to her assistant, "get David here something to drink. What'd you like, sweetie, a vodka?" "Just some water," I said, settling in beside her. "Water with vodka in it?" "No, just the water." "Bring him a vodka tonic," Phyllis instructed, forgetting, I guess, that I don't drink. We were off somewhere when most of the turtles hatched, some 63 of them. We missed the 6 that clawed their way out the following morning as well. Hugh's brother left with the boys on a Sunday, and a few hours later, the final one burst forth. I was on a walk when it happened, and returned minutes after it had stumbled down the trench and into the ocean. It was heartbreaking, Hugh reported. He was standing in his bathing suit on the beach behind our house, one in a crowd of 50 or so. What was so sad, I asked. I mean, he made it, right? Hugh's voice cracked. Yeah, but he was just so alone. I can't believe you missed it, he said when we were going to bed that night. He'd just pulled his shirt off, and I took a moment to admire his tan. It was nothing he'd worked for. Rather, it just came, the result of all the hours he'd spent in the ocean, occasionally with the boys, but mainly on his own, swimming like some sort of creature, one moment on his back and the next on his stomach, turning like a chicken on a spit. He's done this since childhood, and as a result, his shoulders are so broad I can barely get my arms around them. Still, I try. He slips beneath the covers, and I cleave to him like a barnacle, thinking of all the couples I know who no longer share a bed. He snores, the wife will tell me, or I need my own space. I'd hate separate rooms, though a sleep apnea machine might be a deal breaker. Or incontinence. Definitely incontinence. I can't predict what's waiting for us, lurking on the other side of our late middle age. But I know it can't be good. Before returning to England, we drove back to Raleigh and ate lunch with my father, who had a biscuit-sized bandage on his ear and was relying on a walker that had his name and room number written on it in magic marker. I didn't want to meet at Springmore. You told us you were Dave Chappelle. So Lisa and Bob drove him to a cafe we'd all agreed on. Watching him from a distance as he slowly advanced toward the table, I was struck by how breakable he seemed. Still, his spirits were high, and he was engaging, funny even, especially when talking about Springmore and the way the staff will walk in whenever they feel like it. It's a problem because I don't always feel like wearing clothes, if you catch my drift. Sure, I said, thinking, what's wrong with underpants, at least? Kathy met us at the restaurant as well. And midway through our meal, she told my father about the baby loggerheads she'd seen hatching a few days earlier on Emerald Isle. Oh, right, my father said. They've laid their eggs there for centuries, for even longer, I imagine. Eons. And the last one to pop out of the sand, she reported. The very last one. The Turtle Patrol people named Lou. Isn't that something? A more sentimental audience might have moved their hands to their hearts and cooed. Eyes might have misted or filled with actual tears. Had someone named a human baby after my father, called it, say, Lou Sedaris Quitchoff, or better yet, Louis Harry Sedaris Quitchoff, my family might have shared a moment over our salads and sandwiches there at the Belted Goat. But this was an endangered turtle with only a tiny chance of living until the end of the week. And so it was more like naming a bar of soap after someone. If soap could paddle around briefly. What can I tell you, my father said, his voice dry and soft like corn husks being rubbed together. I'm notorious. I'm legendary. I'm a survivor. We have a couple of minutes here, so I was just going to read a few things from my diary. October 10th, Frankfurt. Between interviews at the book fair, my German publicist, Gabi, and I took a walk through the park that serves as a kind of open courtyard between the various buildings. We were seated on a bench drinking coffee when the man beside me, who was my age and had similar teeth with big spaces between them, said, "David? David Sedaris? You helped name my son." It seemed that 18 years earlier he'd asked if he and his wife should go with Hunter or something else that sounded better, and I, for some reason, had gone with Hunter. Chris Johns, this man was called, and he was here to sell foreign rights to books about China. He told me he lives in Saratoga, New York, and as Gabi went back indoors, we got onto the subject of Asia, where he has never been. I told him I was going to Singapore in a few weeks, and he said it was the one place he wouldn't mind visiting. They're against the same things that I am, like gum chewing. My feelings exactly, I said. I'm all for caning people who do that. Not just the ones who stick it under their seats, but the ones I get stuck behind on planes who work it over like cud, their mouths hanging open. It's the same with graffitiers. I say we beat the shit out of them. If I were king, I'd also outlaw balloons, Chris announced. I said, balloons? You know how they get all sad and deflated. Okay, I said. And then they get rained on. He shuddered. A soft, wet balloon. There's nothing worse in the entire world. I thought of AIDS and cancer. I thought of the president. I said. Nothing worse except hummingbirds, Chris continued. God, I hate them. How can you hate hummingbirds, I asked. They're insects, essentially, he said. Big bugs, except, technically they're birds. No, I definitely outlaw them. At this point, Gabi returned, saying we'd better get to my next interview. Chris asked if maybe he and I could have a picture taken together, so I stood beside him with an expression that read as clear as it might were I angry or delighted. How can anyone hate hummingbirds? April 24th, 2014, Austin, Texas. A hotel maid knocked on Billy Collins's door. "Turn down service." "Nobody turns me down," he replied. February 8th, 2017, London. Lee wrote about a man he met on a jazz cruise last week. He's 90 and his wife is 86, and they're divorcing after 65 years of marriage. "We wanted to wait until our children were dead," he explained.
Meet David Sedaris was written and presented by David Sedaris. The producer was Steve Doherty, and it was a Giddy Goat production for BBC Radio 4. Ladies and gentlemen, meet David Sedaris.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you so much. This is an essay that I recently wrote, and it's called The Godfather. I always wanted a godchild, I like to tell people, but I never really cared who it was. This sounds harsh, but it's true. What I longed for was the title. Then, too, I wanted to be good at it, not a deadbeat like my own godfather and those of most of my siblings. My brother Paul got a couple from our church, Mr. and Mrs. Mandikos, who were devoted to him, and Amy lucked out as well. Name anyone else's, though, and you'll be met with blank stares, the way you might if you brought up the Greeks who sold feta cheese out of a tent at the fairgrounds once in 1973. Tiffany Kaminas? Louis Carides? These people were friends of my parents, but not the sorts of friends who lasted. Of course, that's hard to predict when you're in your 20s and certain that all your relationships will stand the test of time. My godfather, a man named Nick Constandy, hung out with my dad when he was young and went on to own a diner in Farmington, New York. He sent me gifts, I'm told, for 1 or 2 years after I was born, but I have no memory of them. I spent time with Nick only once, in the early 70s, when I was 14. Lisa and I were on our way to a summer camp in Greece and stayed one night at his house along with our father, who'd flown up with us from North Carolina. "Louis!" Nick cried as he picked us up at Kennedy Airport. He was short and Greek-looking, which is to say almost but not quite Egyptian-looking, the main characteristics being a strong nose and a single eyebrow that stretched like a black banner from the left side of his face to the right. "So do you have a girlfriend?" he asked me. "No? Why not?" Today a kid could answer, because I have braces and I'm gay. Back then, though, the best you could do was change the subject. Ask Lisa if she has a boyfriend. But Nick wasn't interested in Lisa. He got on the Long Island Expressway, and as we advanced to Farmington, he reminisced about a ski resort he and my father visited in 1950. We went up to practice our manly talents, if you catch my drift. He winked at me in the rearview mirror, and I worried for a moment that my eyes might throw up all over the back seat. I don't want to know about that, I thought. At the house, which was small and box-like, crammed between the nearly identical houses of his neighbors, Nick unlocked the trunk of his car. Then he turned to Lisa and said coldly, the way one might to a servant he had long ago lost patience with, "Carry the suitcases inside." It was the same with dinner. "Lisa, go help my wife in the kitchen." "Lisa, aren't there dishes to do?" Maybe he's not so bad after all, I thought. That night, Nick drove us into Manhattan. It was not a joyous tour. Rather, it was like the television program that would come along a few years later, Scared Straight. He took us to Times Square and up and down the dark, garbage-strewn side streets lined with X-rated movie theaters and prostitutes. There were drunks and pimps in velvet coats. "Can you believe this?" he said. The windows rolled up, although it was August. "It's a zoo!" Must live here someday, I thought. Were it not for Nick's tour and my understanding that anything he reviled and feared was bound to be worth looking into, I might not have set my sights on New York City. Moving there changed my life, started my life. So in that one regard, Nick was an excellent godfather. We wouldn't meet again for another 40 years. He had moved to Fort Lauderdale by then and came to one of my shows. Of course, I didn't recognize him. He must have been in his mid-80s. He was smaller than I remembered, wearing a lime green blazer. I'd never seen that exact shade on anything but a popsicle. So hardly noticed when he handed me a letter. Reading it over that night at my hotel, I was struck not by his message, which was thoughtful, but by his spelling and grammar, which were atrocious, like a child's. What might my godson discover about me some night in the distant future, I wondered. The boy is named Tommy, and I barely knew his parents at the time of his birth. His father, Pete, and I met in Rochester, where I was doing a show, and he was hired to stage manage. The portable printer I used to travel with ran out of ink, so he gave me a ride to the big box store that sold the cartridges I needed, telling me along the way that 10 years earlier, a senior in high school, he weighed more than twice what he did now, over 300 pounds. "How did you lose it?" I asked. "Went to a doctor who told me I could never again eat anything out of a bag," he said. "No fast food, no potato chips." And that did the trick. Pete's father was a locksmith for one of the local colleges. His parents were divorced, and his girlfriend had an aunt who was missing her nose. "A part of it?" I asked. "Nope," he said. "The entire thing." "So she just has a dark cavity in the middle of her face?" "Sure does," he told me. 6 months later, I did a show in Buffalo and saw Pete again. By this time, he and his girlfriend Danielle had married. "She's pregnant," he announced. "We're going to have a baby. Can you believe it?" "Who's the godfather going to be?" I asked. "We haven't thought that far," Danielle said. "But maybe you should be." "Sold," I told them. I maybe should have hesitated, as it's a big commitment, at least when it's done correctly. Crummy godparents gradually fade away, though I once knew a woman who took it one step further and announced after 2 years that she didn't want to do it anymore. She quit her job as a godmother. The friendship with the parents didn't survive, of course. How could it? For the first few years of Tommy's life, Pete, who suffers from chronic back pain, stayed home and took care of him. This while Danielle taught third grade. A second son was born a few years later and turned out to be autistic. Not the kind who's great at math and avoids eye contact, but the kind who never, for one moment, stops moving and seems hardwired to destroy everything he comes into contact with. Charlie might be better now, but when he was 3 and 4, you could not for one moment take your eyes off him, lest he dash the television to the floor or collect everyone's phones to throw into the toilet. While Pete followed him through the house, Tommy would open the door and head down the street to escape the mayhem for a while. When I was 5, that was perfectly acceptable. Now the police are called, and you're hauled before social services for letting your children outside unsupervised. Kids can't do anything on their own anymore. Deface property, egg cars, throw rotten jack-o'-lanterns into ponds. Their parents have to be with them. And God forbid if the child doesn't have a crash helmet on. For a number of years, I couldn't imagine anyone with a worse life than Pete's. He and Danielle didn't even have a bathtub. I mean, babies taking showers. They desperately needed money, which was great from my perspective. I wanted a godchild I could spoil. Under different circumstances, this could have been difficult, but Tommy's brother, who doesn't seem to understand what a toy is, anything you give him is just an object to bash against another object, never feels left out. I know that Tommy has a godmother as well, though I've never met her. What did she send him for his birthday, I'll ask, praying it wasn't as good as what I sent. And of course it never is. How could it be? She doesn't travel the world like I do. She's not rich. Of course, being local, she can spend time with Tommy, but what's more important to a child whose parents can't afford a bathtub? A walk in the park? Or a Lego Death Star that cost $431 and was nearly impossible to find even 6 weeks before Christmas? He eventually grew out of Lego, of course, but still. Take that, godmother, I whispered. I'm rarely there when Tommy opens the gifts I send, but Pete emails me videos, wisely edited to leave out the inevitable, "Is that all?" Every kid cries when there are no more packages to open. They're horrible ingrates, children. And I was no different. It's a bad quality, but sometimes the dissatisfaction is justified. I'm thinking of the time I offered my friend Pam's 5-year-old son a washcloth. "But it's Japanese," I told him, through the locked bathroom door he was sulking behind. I'm the gift giver who obviously never had children of my own. The sort who bought his 6-month-old niece a rabbit fur cape. This to go with the beaded satin gown I sent when she rolled over for the first time. A new mother does not want to dry clean baby clothes, my sister Amy, who had this on good authority, told me. Kids don't want wooden toys either, not even from Switzerland. At least my godson didn't. I'm often let down by how, typical Tommy is. He looks like he came in a box with little boy, or I guess more accurately, little white boy written on the lid. Blue eyes, a button nose, daffodil blonde hair. He dresses like his classmates as well, conforms effortlessly. This year, probably like most of his 9-year-old friends, Tommy wants a Nintendo Switch. I wrote to Pete saying, "I'm happy to buy this, but are you sure you want him to have it?" A few months earlier, I bought him a trumpet, which cost $700. He'd better be serious about this, I thought, as I mailed off the check, thinking later, I wasn't serious about anything when I was his age. In my case, the instrument was a guitar, which sat unused and despised between my weekly lessons. "Have you been practicing?" my teacher would ask. He was what you'd now call a little person. And over the years, I've met a surprising number of people who also took lessons from him. One, a woman who went to his house once and reported that it, quote, smelled like ass. Yes, I've been practicing, I'd say, unaware of how transparent my lie was. I was just like the rest of them, the ones without passion, the ones wasting his valuable time. Why would I expect Tommy to be any different from me? Because I paid for his instrument? I suspect that his Nintendo Switch will put an end to everything not Nintendo Switch. Homework, trumpet practice, time outdoors. The last time I saw Tommy, he was 7, and all he cared about was Pokemon Go. Dad, give me your phone. Dad, can I have your phone? Give me your phone, Dad, Dad, can I have your phone? Give me your phone. Dad, give it to me just for a minute, just for 10 minutes. Dad, give me your phone. Give me your phone, Dad, give me your phone. Dad, give me your phone. It was like spending time with a junkie. I was only in town for a couple of hours. The plan was to take Tommy shopping for school clothes, but all he cared about was that damn game, which at least put him out in the world. Not so the Switch. Hugh's brother's grandchildren, 7-year-old Austin and Harrison, who's 11, have one, and it's their whole life. I spent a week with the boys one summer and visited their town in Washington State for Thanksgiving 3 months later. I thought we'd had a good time together, but neither of them looked up from their game or even said hello when I walked into the room they were occupying. "It's me," I announced. "Uh-huh." On the table beside the TV monitor were the many postcards I'd sent since we last saw each other. Have they even read them, I wondered? The boys resignedly endure games intended for their age group while simultaneously watching YouTube videos of people playing the much more violent ones John won't allow them to have. This is something I knew nothing about. Professional gamers, usually guys in their late teens and 20s who film themselves excelling at things like, in this case, Grand Theft Auto, The Grinch. I walked in as Santa stepped out of a car. He was fitter than I'd ever seen him. Still with a white beard, but clearly muscled, wiry almost. On his back was a knapsack full of toys, along with, oh, look, a sawed-off shotgun. I watched as he moved with cold-blooded purpose toward another, better-looking car driven by a middle-aged woman who opened her door and fled, screaming at his approach. The stranger posed no threat to Santa, so it surprised me when he raised his weapon and shot her in the back of the head. "Oh, my God," I said. "What did he have to do that for?" "She's just collateral damage," Austin explained, reaching for a slice of pizza. "His real target is the Grinch." "Yeah, but that's Santa." Austin laughed. "You ain't seen nothing yet." It was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, as far as I was concerned. Santa brutally murdered just as many people as the Grinch did. It was hard for me to see him as a hero, though maybe that's beside the point. Speaking as someone who has never played a video game, who had never even seen one before Austin and Harrison showed me what Minecraft looked like a few months earlier, I was shocked. How can this be good for anyone? Much less a child, I wondered in the dark, sour room where the boys sat, spellbound. They'd wanted me to get them violent games for their joint birthday celebration, and were disappointed when I handed them a small plastic card. "What's this?" "A family pool membership," I said. "Isn't that great? I went by this afternoon, and there's a rock climbing wall right above the water. I mean, you can just let go and drop into the deep end." When they showed no enthusiasm, I told them how much it cost. $400, but don't worry about thanking me. The boy sighed, and I watched as Santa shot another unarmed woman in the back of the head. "You just wasted your money. We probably won't even go more than 3 times a year." In my imagination, the two would be bitten by the swimming bug, would go on to earn scholarships, and maybe even a shot at the Olympics. And all because Mr. Sedaris gave us that family pool membership all those years ago, they'd say, stooped from all the gold medals around their necks. It was, I hoped, like giving the trumpet to Tommy, potentially life-changing. "I was on the swim team when I was your age," I told the boys, "and it was great." A bigger lie was never told in that house. But at least the first part was true. I was on the swim team. I just hated every second of it. "Look," the boy said, pointing to the TV screen. "Here's the Grinch again. He's a killing machine." 2 days later, Austin and Harrison's mother announced that though it was a nice thought, the pool membership would be a waste. "We'll never go. The kids are too busy with their martial arts." And so I got my money back, thinking, well, fine, see if I care. The boys had told me what they wanted, and anything less, of course, was going to disappoint them. The killer was that giving them the video games they'd asked for would only mean more time in a dark room, cut off from the rest of us, exercising nothing but their fingers. "Who are your godfathers?" I asked Austin and Harrison. "Our whats?" I felt hopeful for a moment, thinking I could take them on as additional clients. Then I realized I don't actually need the title. I have plenty of friends who have had children, and I've been in their lives since they were born, writing them, sending gifts, and mourning a bit as they grow older. Who gave you permission to turn from 6 to 7, I'll think? Who allowed you to make the sorts of friends who need to be liked every 5 minutes on that goddamn phone of yours? Don't you know those people won't last the way that I will? Me, who with no authority whatsoever bragged about how smart and delightful, how unlike other kids you once were? My niece has entered that phase. Everything happens on the screen of her iPhone. I watch her scrolling away, doing God knows what. And I think, well, maybe our time is later, when she's much older. I didn't start a relationship with my only aunt until we reconnected at my mother's funeral. From then until her own death in 1995, we were in constant contact. She was a buoyant, big-hearted woman, like my mom physically, but not self-destructive like her. I often kick myself for all the time we missed, but at least we had 4 good years together, and it led me back to my cousins, who were wonderful as well. Then, too, a nephew-aunt relationship, like a godparent-godchild relationship, is a two-way street. When you're young, you get a pass. But at a certain point, the kid has to give back a little. At the very least, he or she should start sending thank you letters. I gripe about my godfather, but did I ever write him? Did I ever call? My Aunt Joyce was always a good aunt, but we didn't form a relationship until I became a good nephew. My father might have disinterested, ungrateful children, but he was blessed with an excellent godson. From the very start, Mike was the boy my father always wanted, smart, athletic, devoted to his parents. All I ever heard growing up was, "My godson this, my godson that." When talking to other people, I imagined my father swallowing the word God, so it sounded like his actual son he was boasting about. Mike got accepted to West Point at the same time I dropped out of college, so there was that to deal with. I wanted to hate the guy, but he was just too nice. Not a jock, not a know-it-all, but soft-spoken and truly humble. He's only a few years younger than me, but has always made it a point to call my father and stay in touch. He's probably still getting $10 checks for his birthday, but no matter. He and his wife live in London now, and we'll get together every so often. "I talked to your dad last week," he'll tell me. "Really?" I'll say. "How's he doing?" As with him and my dad, I suspect that Tommy and I will eventually have our day. Maybe in 10 years, maybe in 25. In the meantime, I'll continue to write and send gifts, reminding him that I'm here if he needs me. And that lots of kids would kill to have me as a godfather. Thank you. I was going to read a few things from my diary here. December 22nd, 2018, London. After lunch yesterday, Amy and I headed to the Dover Street Market, where I saw an exquisite taxidermied kiwi standing on a thin rectangle of polished wood. Its head was lowered, and I knew immediately that I had to have it. "How much?" I asked. £8,000, the sales clerk told me. It's over 100 years old. So that put an end to that. You should have snapped the beak off, then asked, how much is it now? Amy suggested. March 26, 2018, London. This morning's Washington Post included an article on Stormy Daniels, the porn actress who discussed her affair with Donald Trump on 60 Minutes last week. She's been getting attacked on social media, but not everyone worries she won't be able to defend herself. Anyone who's seen Miss Daniels' work, reads a response to the article, knows that she can most certainly take it on the chin. April 23rd, 2018, St. Louis. Adam met me at the baggage claim yesterday afternoon, and together we headed to the airport's multi-level parking deck. This involved taking an elevator, and we just stepped inside one and pressed a button for our floor when a voice called, "Wait!" It was a woman with 2 daughters, aged maybe 8 and 10. Adam held the closing doors, and the girls ran in beside us, panting. Their mother, meanwhile, who was pushing a luggage cart, looked back in the direction she had come from, at her husband, I suppose, who was still a good distance away. The door started to close again, and she yelled to her daughters in a panicky voice, 3! Go to level 3! Go to level 3 and wait for us there! As the door closed further, I said to the woman what have to be the scariest words any parent can hear. They're our girls now. August 26, 2017, Rackham, West Sussex. Late last summer, I came upon a mountain of trash someone had fly-tipped a dozen or so yards off the road near the bird sanctuary. There were paint buckets and rollers, sheets of plastic, boards with nails in them, and several bags. I went through them, found some receipts, and called the police. It's taken a year, but earlier this week, the person who dumped it was fined £1,000. He's 54 and lives in Hove, and I got him in trouble. Okay. I think we have time here for a few questions, if anybody has one.
Would you ever go on a nudist beach?
Would I ever go on a nudist beach? In 1995, I believe, I went to a nudist trailer park in the United States, a senior citizens nudist trailer park, to write about it, because I don't even go around in my bare feet in the house. I am so uncomfortable being naked, so no, I would. And I managed to stay at this place for 10 days, and it was like the world turned upside down. I lived in a trailer, and so I would be in a trailer fully dressed, and someone would knock on the door, and I'd say, "Just a minute!" And I'd be frantically taking my clothes off, because if you answered the door with your clothes on, they'd think, "What's going on here?" And I look back, and I cannot believe I did that. But I couldn't possibly do it now.
What's the worst and the best piece of taxidermy you've ever seen?
The best is that taxidermy kiwi that I saw. And I'm really hoping, I shouldn't be telling you this, but someone you know was recently inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, which is only 250 people are allowed, and they're writers and they're visual artists, and Toni Morrison is a member, and I.M. Pei is a member, and somebody dies, and then somebody else is allowed in. So Philip Roth died, and I got the call. And I think I deserve that kiwi as a gift. And I'm really hoping, and I went back to the Dover Street Market and it was gone. And I'm really hoping that Hugh bought it for me as a gift, because I get inducted into the Academy on May 24th. And if that kiwi is not waiting for me after my induction, I'm really going to break his neck, because I completely deserve it. So that kiwi is pretty great. And then there was a guy named Potter who had a museum here, and he did these elaborate dioramas. You know, he had a kitten wedding. Anyway, everything went for auction in 2003. And then I wound up with these sword-fighting squirrels. And they are so beautifully done. And one of them just got pierced right here, and he's like, oh. And there's a blood stain on his chest. So I don't have crummy my taxidermy that I have, it's only the best when it comes to my taxidermy. Thank you so very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Meet David Sedaris was written and presented by David Sedaris. The producer was Steve Doherty, and it was a Giddy Goat production for BBC Radio 4.